Joining us now is Gabriel Debenedetti. He is the national correspondent for New York Magazine and author of Bernie Sanders is Quietly Building a Digital Media Empire. Gabriel, thanks for being here.
Oh, thanks so much.
So I think a lot of us, and I'm sure particularly people who watch and listen to this show, have caught different pieces of Bernie content over the last several months, whether it's a streamed YouTube town hall on inequality, whether it's an explainer video on everything from the inequities in the tax code to why we need to, preserve the Iran deal as an example. But you actually kind of map out that there's a real strategy here that in some ways is sort of could be harnessed both certainly for a presidential run, but is also actually getting to some of Bernie Sanders' sort of deepest desires as a politician and concerns about corporate media that go back to his start in politics as an independent candidate in the 1970s.
Yeah, that's exactly right. I mean, we don't know yet if how much of what he's doing now is geared towards 2020. And in fact, he says none of it is geared towards 2020, and we'll talk about all that later, he says. But he has certainly been trying to find an alternative to the mainstream media for 40 years. He, going back to when he was first running for mayor, he's been talking about in Burlington. He's been talking about the problems with the corporate mainstream media. When he first ran for re-election, he announced it by printing out his own fake newspaper that he, distributed around town. And after that, he had his own radio show, his own TV show, a few versions of his own TV show. Essentially, the idea here is that he's been trying to figure out ways to connect directly with voters for ages. This is one of the things that he thinks about most, and it's not a surprise to anyone who's heard him give his standard stump speech. But what's interesting now is that he has this operation in his Senate office. It's just 3 staffers and 3 interns. But they're
paid interns, as you point out.
Paid interns.
Yep.
That's right.
Yep.
But they're cranking out these videos nonstop. In 2017, they put out over 500 videos, and some of these, as you say, are these live streams. And when he does these live streams, he's been getting more viewers than CNN at the same time. So it's really something that's quite remarkable that a lot of folks on Capitol Hill didn't even realize was happening until I published this story. I got a lot of people reach out to me and say, I had no idea, because he doesn't do he's not particularly aggressive about promoting this. He's essentially just, showing it to his own backers and anyone that stumbles upon his Facebook page.
Yeah, so, but at the same time, the numbers are astonishing. And I mean, obviously people know by now you'd have to be really, disconnected from political reality. He obviously has a lot of backers, and he ran a very strong race in 2016. But do you get the sense that this reception, I mean, obviously there's already a built-in constituency for him, and they're sort of, attempting to broaden out through things like Our Revolution and support different kinds of candidates. But at the same time, he's getting into this algorithm-driven, very distinct media space that a lot of people, obviously, in traditional media and politics don't particularly understand. I think also a fair amount of us kind of navigating this space don't entirely understand it either, because some of the methodology is pretty opaque behind it. But do you get a sense that he might also be tapping into, new people, actually sort of, starting the process that he started so late in 2016, potentially earlier? And I guess not to frame it inside 2020, but just in terms of like a kind of broader outreach and exposure to new sets of potential constituents and voters for, the agenda he pushes writ large, even regardless of 2020.
Yeah, that's something that I asked him about directly when I.
Hello? Gabriel. I think we'll just call him right back. I'm not really sure what happened there. All right.
This album is dedicated to all the teachers that told me I never amount to nothing. To all the people that lived above the buildings that I was hustling from, that called the police on me when I was just trying to make some money to feed my daughter. And all the struggle, you know what I'm saying? It's all good, baby. It was all a dream. I used to read.
A little more Biggie Never Hurt Anybody. Gabriel, you were saying, go ahead.
I am here. Yes. Sorry about that.
No problem.
What I was saying is that this is something that I talked to Senator Sanders about. I asked him specifically when we were talking about this project of his, whether he's reaching out to some people. And his answer is sort of that he's always reaching out to more people, and that this is not specifically a strategy to find new voters for any particular election. But, I talked to a lot of his staffers who've been working with him for a very long time, and what he has always said is that he does have an ambition to create some sort of alternative news network that just talks about policy and reaches the biggest possible audience, bigger than the New York Times if possible. That's what he's always compared himself to. And if that includes reaching out to new people and getting new people on board, that's great. But that's not his primary interest right now. What he's trying to do is figure out ways to build this as broadly as possible. But as I said, he's not really promoting this in any way, although sometimes he does do, he will work together with other alternative news networks and try and get some other people to pay attention here. But for now, he's not focused on, for example, building his campaign list or anything like that. And it's important to note that a lot of this is being done within his Senate office. It's not part of his campaign team, which of course is still up and running. And when you ask him about the political side of it, he sort of gets a bit frustrated. He sees those as two different issues because, of course, this is something that he's been trying to do for years, and the campaign is also something that he's been trying to do for a long time, but it's different.
Do you think that it's also striking when he talks about it, is that he sort of has two parts of his critique. There's the stuff that, I think everybody would expect. Like, why isn't media talking about the most important issues? Why aren't they talking about, climate, poverty, inequality, banks, healthcare, the policy. But he also seems, and you kind of alluded to it there, he also almost has this other sort of like back in my day, we could have long conversations about things, like kind of a critique of the medium too. I mean, does that make sense?
Yeah, there's no doubt about that. He's, anyone who's heard one of his stump speeches on the campaign trail, or really what he's been saying pretty consistently for decades, knows that he's no fan of the modern media and what he has called the modern media since the 1970s. But, one of his central critiques is essentially not just that, the news shows don't, as you say, talk about the central issues. And he thinks that has a lot to do with advertisers and with the fact they're run by corporations with their own bottom lines. But the other side of it is he just doesn't like the format, and so on these videos that he puts out, a whole lot of them don't have him at all in them. It's primarily real people, and there's very little talk about, there's almost no talk about Robert Mueller or the Russia investigation or anything like that. It's basically all about policy, and that's because he doesn't like these talking heads. And, very importantly here, let's not pretend that this is a straight-ahead news show. Of course, it is his point of view, so it's not as if there's much room for dissent from that either.
Yeah, of course. Does he talk? He also speaks about his sort of frustration with that specifically. And I'm wondering if maybe, again, it's an outlier poll, so I wouldn't get sort of overly freaked out about it, but there is this new, millennials drifting away from Democrats poll. And again, I mean, the first thing to say is it's an outlier, and overall the numbers don't reflect that, particularly with millennials. But if one had to speculate, at least me, I would speculate part of the reason might be that if the kind of primary identification of Democrats in media is just this sort of one-track obsession with, not only Russia and Mueller, but just any type of Trump whatever, at the expense of everything else. Does he speak to that directly, and how does he balance, and maybe he's not trying to balance, but how does he balance both the needed critique of, like, as an example, MSNBC, it's just Russia, 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 Stormy Daniels, Russia, and we need to talk about, some actual things too. How does he balance that at the same time with also, part of the people he is talking to are, obviously, Democrats who really do hate and are kind of uniquely disturbed by Donald Trump. How does he kind of thread that? Has he threaded that needle by trying to bring those worlds together at all? Like, even if we looked at something like Trump and Russia, maybe we could look at, international money laundering and tax havens and, how that fits with the inequality narrative. Is that what he's doing?
It's more or less that, yeah. I think, as I said earlier, it's important to remember that the way that this is happening is it's essentially, a lot of these are really press releases in video form. This is just his way of opining on the news often. And what he does very frequently is he will not talk about investigations, whether it's Mueller or Stormy Daniels or anything like that, but exactly what you just said. He'll talk about tax havens, or he will talk about foreign policy issues. So there is a lot of Trump talk on this Bernie TV, but it's very, very closely targeted so he can make a broader point about policy. He doesn't certainly say anything positive about Donald Trump, but he's not really talking about the news that, you would think would be the top story of the day if you're watching cable news or reading the big newspapers every morning. And his argument is basically like, listen, I just want to talk about policy. And if Trump gives me an opportunity to do that, I'll do it. But the reason that Trump is bad is not because of Mueller.
Do you think his it's that in the same way in 2016 that some of the same reasons that maybe people who look at the sort of horse race stuff and would kind of say like, oh, he's gruff and his suits are rumpled and blah blah blah, and actually in the environment of 2016 it sort of worked in his favor, that he was kind of like this sort of unapologetic kind of no nonsense kind of like gruff grandpa that's looking out for you kind of thing. Do you think that also fits the specific mediums that he's playing? Like, that people who are looking to YouTube and podcasting and everything, that it's a bit more, it's, I guess the simplest way is it's not as polished.
Exactly. It's definitely, it's very informal. And that is an important thing that he likes to focus on. I mean, obviously these videos are pretty well produced for the most part, but they're clearly produced quickly. They're not, cable news segments or certainly documentary type things. And I think that informality and that level of direct connection to real people who are watching it is exactly what he's going for. It doesn't necessarily work if you're trying to win over people in a long political argument and they want to see polished arguments in front of them. But it certainly does work if you're trying to go viral, or if you're just trying to reach out to your voters and quickly explain what you need to get across to them. And again, that's basically what he's doing here. He's not trying to create, Oscar-winning documentaries.